if one can have a rational method to prioritize which of those four might be preferable, then that's a useful outcome. And if it can be transparent and objective, then that can be even more useful for the political people that are involved in that sort of decision making. And also try and make the most effective use of available institutional, public sector, or private sector resources that are available. In the last couple of years, Natural Resources Canada, there's a few of those people in the audience today, have been involved in some substantial funding of a few different initiatives with respect to developing some potentially useful tools for some of the decision making. One of these relates to some work being done through the Canadian Institute of Planners, and another involves Engineers Canada, what used to be called the Canadian Council of Professional Engineers, and a broad-based committee called PIDC, which we'll talk a little about later. But in making an evaluation of infrastructure vulnerability, I'll suggest to you that really what one's looking at is an evaluation of different relationships that are existing. And these relationships, I'll suggest, are sort of three-part relationships. One is with respect to the infrastructure itself. A second component is the change involved. And the third is the performance criteria by which that infrastructure is being considered a success or a failure for achieving its goals. I'll elaborate a little bit on that. And then also look at evaluating infrastructure vulnerability and adaptive capacity in a numerical way, in an objective way. And then also the conclusions that come from a risk management action. These might be related, unfamiliar to many in the audience, relate to information type actions. We need more information. We didn't know enough to come to a serious conclusion. Another might be management or adaptation type responses. Another might be new initiatives or mitigation type responses. And it may be also that part of an evaluation, no further action is an outcome. It happens. In terms of the infrastructure change performance relationships to be evaluated, infrastructure might be classified as a class of infrastructure. It might be an individual piece, a particular dam somewhere. It might be a subcomponent of it. If it was this building, it might be somebody who's interested in the heating, ventilation, air conditioning component of it. It might be related to geography. It might be related to the life cycle stage of that infrastructure. Is it new? Is it mature? Is it at the tail end of its lifespan? There might be different ways of looking at that infrastructure. In terms of change, I think we heard earlier today that there's more than just climate change that ought to be taken into account with infrastructure. There are other things that can have a similar impact or outcome. An example of that is the land use cover with respect to stormwater runoff values. So in the presentation we saw before the break, it showed pictures of a hillside area with trees and with fewer trees, with buildings and residential areas. And over the life cycle of a piece of infrastructure, if it's a stormwater control measure downstream, be it a hard pipe or a basin or something like that, whether or not the land feeding into it over 40, 50 years is going to stay forested, or if there's a realistic possibility that it'll turn into residential or meadowland or whatever, that change in cover can have a much greater change in the potential blast of water that may be coming through a system than climate change alone might ever be. So take into account not just climate change, but those other changes that might also similarly impact or affect on what's happening. Also, in terms of performance goals, again, before the break, we heard an example of a highway that still existed, but it was flooded out, and hence it couldn't be used. These islands of people were stressed because they were there alone, and life wasn't normal. And yet that was a case where structurally that highway is in place, but it failed in its performance to function as a highway. Some people yesterday saw the slide from Toronto, from Finch Avenue, where it's structurally that failed, and yet functionally that area still worked to carry the natural gas. Maybe a little nervous on how long you'd want to go that long, but I just want to point out there's a series of performance goals that could be taken into account in evaluating whether infrastructure is working or not working. And they can include structural integrity, functionality, capacity, serviceability, stability, maintenance and operations, biophysical. We have a park and we expect this amount of animal life to be happening there. Climate change goes from X to Y. Does this, in a biological sense, still work the way we anticipate it? There could be social and financial and other types of performance goals that are being used. If climate change is but a modification or an extra element into regular decision-making that's already happening with respect to infrastructure, then perhaps a practical approach for communicating climate change values to those that are making some of the decision-makings is to put it in a format that's familiar to the end user. In the design of the building that we're in today, climate and weather information was taken into account in its design and construction from some values from the National Building Code. That is a format for climate and weather information that is already being used. If one were presenting climate change information in a similar format, then those people who normally design the analysis and materials and that sort of thing can do the same thing. It's just adjusting a value for what's already happening. Similarly, for the stormwater type decision making and watershed work, that's often driven by intensity, duration, frequency curves of the precipitation or rainfall. So if one can present climate change information in that format, then those people can continue to make the same type of decision making, but now you're taking climate change into account. We'll talk about constraints as we go through this in terms of how easy or how tricky is it to actually get information into that format. But if you can get it in that format, then the current system for doing decision making can continue to work, I'll suggest, in an effective way. Similarly, flood mapping. If certain policies are already forward about here are the do's and don'ts within a 100-year floodplain area, and one's looking to take climate change into account, and that original do's and don'ts were based on the risks associated with what happens in a 100-year event, then I'll suggest it may not be that one needs to change the policy of the do's and don'ts in one 100-year event, but you may end up changing what the map is for what the footprint is associated with that 100-year event. Similarly, heat units, which is more on the agricultural side, to a lesser extent on the heating ventilation side, can also be a way of expressing climate change in a way that decision makers can take into account. In terms of prioritizing different relationships, I'll suggest to you there isn't a hard and fast rule for how that happens. And different people of good intent will have different methods to approach that. But in general, you can be taking in something like the likelihood of the magnitude of something happening combined with the severity of the consequences. And it may not be vital whether this is based on 0 to 7 or 1 to 10 or something else. It may not be vital what the weighting is back and forth. I'll suggest that often those people that are closest to the current decision making with respect to infrastructure are probably best placed to make those judgment calls. Because at the end of the day, what comes out of it isn't so much what the value is, but how it is relative to all the other things that you're looking at. And so people may use slightly different ways of evaluating. But if the high stuff generally comes out high and the low stuff generally comes out low, then you have an effective decision making happening. Also, there are ways of one could prioritize between different types of infrastructure, and perhaps between prioritizing between similar infrastructure in terms of which one might merit a greater evaluation, greater attention to detail, or a greater use of available resources. In terms of doing a quantitative evaluation of infrastructure change performance relationship,